Some of the smartest people in history have disagreed about whether God exists. Not just like regular people, but philosophers, scientists, experts, people who study this question for a living and have been looking at the arguments for their whole life and looked at all the arguments of the people that lived before them that thought about this. And the weird part of this whole thing is it's actually not obvious that one side or the other is being irrational. So in this talk, I want to think more about that. What is going on here? And then what does it mean for you, what you should believe? Here's a cute little picture of my family. So now I have two little boys. Asher is 3 and Silas is 7 months. So there's a little personal aside. All right. So getting into it, here's an obvious datum. People disagree about religion. Obviously, people disagree about what religion is true, but here I'm just going to focus on disagreement about whether God exists. Um, Here today, I want to talk about why. Why do people disagree about religion? What does this tell us about kind of the nature of religious belief and our evidence for and against the existence of God? And in the end, how should we as individuals respond to all of this? And to give a little bit of a preview, I'm going to actually argue that these facts about religion, disagreement, belief, and evidence actually might give us more control over whether we believe in God than you might have thought at first blush. Okay, so here's the plan for today. I want to give some background, just some of the background concepts. Some people who watch this channel a lot will be familiar, but I think it's really helpful to kind of get us all on the same page. And then I'm going to give 3 bad responses to religious disagreement. Some things people have said, even professional philosophers have said, that I think are not the right response. I'm going to give my personal response to all this disagreement, 3 reasons or arguments that support my response, and then go from these kind of facts about other people's, their debates, their beliefs, their disagreement to you. Like, what does this mean for you as an individual? And then wrap up and conclude. All right, so starting with some background. The first, for people who have watched my channel, this will be familiar, but basically there's 3 belief attitudes you can take to any really statement or proposition that you consider. Here we'll focus on the question of whether God exists. So the proposition God exists or there is a God, 3 belief attitudes, right? There's theists. Theists say, yes, God exists, so they believe God exists. They say it's true, God exists, okay? Agnostics say, I'm undecided on whether God exists. I haven't made up my mind either way. I'm withholding belief on whether God exists. And atheists say, no, God does not exist. There is no God, right? So the theist and the atheist, they've kind of made up their mind. They take opposite perspective. So the agnostic's like, I don't know. I'm not sure whether God exists. I am undecided. Okay. Second concept, epistemic rationality. Sounds like a big term, but I think it's really not that difficult. It's basically when we say you're believing rationally or you're believing the way you should. That's often where I think we're referring to something like epistemic rationality. And this is rationality that's focused on getting at the truth and avoiding error. So rationality that makes it more likely we'll get true beliefs and less likely we'll get false beliefs. So, believing things, we'll see in a second, like supported by evidence, believing things that there's good reason to think are true, following experts, etc., right? So this is not about whether a belief is morally good. This is also not whether about whether a belief is useful or maybe would make you happy, practically beneficial. This is about whether the belief is likely to be true. All right. The final concept is evidentialism, and I have videos on a lot of these background concepts. I can link those in the description if you're kind of interested in diving more deeply. But basically, evidentialism is the idea that we're rational when our beliefs fit the evidence. So what makes someone epistemically rational is their beliefs fitting their evidence. Rational for me to believe that I'm in St. Louis right now. I'm really in the greater St. Louis area. We don't actually technically live in St. Louis, right? Rational for me to believe it's sunny outside. It's rational for me to believe it rained last night. It's not rational for me to believe there's an invisible pink unicorn in the room, even if I love unicorns, because I don't have good evidence for that. It's not rational for me to believe that my sons are both going to be in the NBA, as much as that would be really fun and in some sense I want that to be true. Yeah, that's very unlikely, right? So rational belief is belief that fits your evidence. That's pretty much what we'll be working with here for this talk. Okay, really important clarification. It is something that people familiar with philosophy will be aware of, but I think a lot of people miss, especially people who haven't thought about belief and rationality a lot. And that's that rational belief and true belief are not the same thing. Rational belief is sort of a matter of doing the best with the evidence that you have. True belief is belief that fits reality, that corresponds to the world. I have a whole video on this, I'll link that. But here's basically the way I look at it. And I just said this already, right? When your belief is true, it matches reality. Your belief that snow is white is true. What that means is snow is actually white in the actual world, right? Your belief that your favorite team will win the game is true when your favorite team actually wins the game. Rational belief is belief that fits your evidence, right? So you might have lots of evidence that your belief will, or sorry, that your favorite team will lose, then it's rational for you to believe that they'll lose, even if, by some miracle they end up winning, right? So you can have rational false beliefs when your evidence is misleading, right? Again, if you have a bunch of evidence your team is going to lose, you believe they're going to lose, but they end up winning, then that could be a belief that ends up, or sorry, yeah, a belief that's rational but does end up being false. You could think about like in March Madness a couple years ago, it was like the first time a 16 seed had ever upset a 1 seed. And if someone believed like, okay, the 1 seed's gonna win, that's rational, right? Like never in the history of March Madness have if we ever had an upset that great. But the belief does end up being false. So you have misleading evidence. You can also have irrational true beliefs if you just get a lucky guess. You can actually take the reverse of that, right? If you believed the 16 seed would win, you just got really lucky. You didn't really have good evidence for that. And so even though your belief ended up being true, it wasn't rational. We use the example of like your magic 8 ball, right? It's this like ball that you shake it and it just gives you random answers. If for some reason you just totally trust your magic 8 ball and you're like, is it going to rain tomorrow? Shake, shake, shake. Oh, magic 8 ball says yes. Okay, I believe it's going to rain tomorrow. And it actually happens to rain. That's an irrational belief that ends up being true. Okay. So here's why this matters for us. When we disagree, say I believe God doesn't exist, you believe God does exist, right? We both cannot be right. It cannot be the case that God exists and God doesn't exist. That's just not possible. But we could, in theory, both be rational, okay? If both of our beliefs fit the evidence, or if we have different evidence in some sense, then it is possible we could both be rational. We just both can't be right. So I'm not arguing a proposition can be both true and false at the same time, right? But I am arguing that people who disagree could, in some sense, as we'll see, possibly both be rational. Okay. So we have religious disagreement. We have this big puzzle. Why does it seem, like what explains this like big long disagreement about God's existence and like who's rational, who's right, what's going on? Okay. I'm going to start off with 3 bad responses to this question of why haven't we figured out whether God exists yet? Why is there still so much disagreement? I think we should reject all 3 of these. Okay, so first response is this idea that only theists are rational. So the only people responding truly and rationally to the evidence are theists. We're the only ones kind of correctly responding. Someone who takes this view would say, look, when you look at the evidence, it really does objectively support theism. And this is, in some sense, maybe if it should be obvious to people, maybe people are kind of biased or in denial. For whatever reason, those who take other views, agnostics and atheists, they're simply not rational. Okay. So I did cite some people that say something like this view. Some people even said some of what Plantinga says seems to suggest something like this. Again, not clear Plantinga is making a claim. Yeah, it's not clear Plantinga is making a claim about rationality, but there are philosophers, especially theistic philosophers, that sort of hint at a view kind of like this. Okay, here's some problems with this view. Really, I think it's just too restrictive. It has too restrictive of a notion of rationality, and I don't think it's like fair to the diversity of evidence that we see. So I do think there's serious, interesting, important evidence for atheism that we shouldn't just dismiss. The problem of evil is a huge, big problem. And if you say, oh, it's just a stupid problem or it's not a real philosophical problem, you're not understanding the weight of the problem. There's also the problem of divine hiddenness. right? How could a good and God and loving God, okay, in the case of evil, permit some of the terrible, awful evils that we see, like the Holocaust or child rape or cancer, right? And then how could, like, why isn't a good and loving God that desires a relationship with God's creatures more clear? Why is God's existence in some sense difficult to see? So I think like these kinds of problems, it doesn't take this kind of view doesn't take that evidence seriously. So yeah, so basically the problem here is I don't think it matches the reality of the disagreement that we see. It's like you guys are all committing an irrational error. I don't think that's really what's going on. I think it's something deeper about the nature of the evidence. So yeah, I want to reject this view. The next view is basically the parallel view, but in the atheistic case, right? So this view would say only atheists are rational. The evidence, again, objectively supports, instead of theism in this case, it's atheism, and those who take other views are not rational. So, like the new theists, like Dennett, perhaps, might take a view like this. I know at least they have a lot of pretty negative things to say about faith, so I think, yeah, it's plausible they would take a view like this. Um, really, the problem here, it's the same issue in reverse. It's too restrictive, but in the other direction. It doesn't take the evidence for theism seriously enough. Like, I think the fine-tuning argument is a really interesting argument for the existence of God that we should take seriously. There's cosmological arguments, ontological arguments. I know those are all controversial, but so are the arguments for the existence or against the existence of God, right? There's some like new, really interesting arguments too, like the moral knowledge argument. And yeah, there's just like a number of considerations here that I think are worth taking seriously. Again, that doesn't mean the case is decisive in either direction, but like this is again just like a dismissive perspective, I think, that doesn't match the reality of like this long-standing disagreement that we see where both parties really do seem to have evidence in their favor. So the main idea so far, both sides have serious arguments for and against, and that's just like the nature of our argument, our evidence for God's existence. And I think people that deny that are not really being fair to the nature of the evidence. Like that raises puzzles. Like right, that's why we're talking about this today. It's like a philosophical puzzle, especially if you are like a theist. Like there's a puzzle, right? But I still think I definitely think we shouldn't be in denial about the nature of the evidence. Okay. Final bad response. Response three, we should just all be agnostic. So there's lots of disagreement about this. The evidence is so complicated. It's just like confusing. It's hard to figure out. We've been debating about this since we have like written records of philosophy, right? We should just all withhold belief. This is sort of what Feldman suggests in his paper called Reasonable Religious Disagreements, I think is the title. Um, I don't think this is right. I think this is too cautious, actually. Because I think it's not like a coin flip case. I don't think it's tied evidence. I think it's really complicated evidence. There's all this evidence for, there's all this evidence against. It doesn't just weigh up perfectly against each other. It's qualitatively diverse. There's been like these debates going on for centuries that you can enter into and dedicate your life to and still not read everything that's been written. Just a Problem of Evil, if anyone's seen like Justin Mooney's bibliography, has like hundreds, if not thousands, of just contemporary things written on it, right? So the evidence is really complicated. It's really multifaceted. It's really qualitatively diverse. And I think because of that, it's not a coin flip case. And it could be okay to look at the evidence and kind of take that risk and be a theist and take that risk and be an atheist. What I mean by that is there's something riskier about believing or disbelieving that withholding it like doesn't have. Withholding kind of the safe option. But I think to say we all have to withhold, that's just not fair to like the good evidence we have for or the good evidence we have against the existence of God. So put another way, I think just because there's a controversial topic, so God's existence is obviously what we're talking about here, but that applies to like lots of other questions in philosophy, ethics, questions at the edge of the scientific debates, like just because it's controversial and there's complicated evidence for and against, doesn't mean it's irrational to have an opinion about it. So I don't think this idea that we all are obliged to be agnostic because of how complicated the evidence is, I don't think that's correct. Okay, so now what we're going to do is get into sort of my view of what to say about this religious disagreement. I think all three perspectives on God's existence can be rational. Okay, so to clarify, Rational does not mean true, right? I don't think God exists and God doesn't exist. Rational belief and true belief are different. But I don't think one group just has this clear rational edge or this obvious epistemic advantage over the other two. I don't think there's just this default view that we should all take given the evidence, right? Okay, so you might think that's weird. You might be like, how are you arguing this as a theist? Or you might think, no, that just can't be the right perspective on this, right? Debates about God's existence get really heated really fast. But let me give three reasons for my view. Okay. The first reason just has to do with how widespread this disagreement has been. Okay. So, like we talked about at the beginning, this is not just lay people that have not really thought about the question much, or like people that haven't read much, like disagreeing about it. People that have dedicated their lives to this question disagree. Smart, informed people that have read the arguments, that are well aware of the considerations for and against, fall in different places on the spectrum of theist, atheist, agnostic. So philosophers, scientists, also ordinary people disagree. Um, this kind of falls into two categories here. So there's like historical disagreement. Many of the great philosophers were theists, so Augustine, Aquinas, Descartes, Leibniz, etc., right? But some weren't. Hume, Wittgenstein were not theists. So there's this like historical split. But also, in the contemporary kind of debate, there's also a split. So in the general population, I think more people are theists than atheists. So I looked up some statistics. In 2017, it was like about 80% of the world's population were theists. I think that's actually slightly declining. I'm not 100% sure about that. But like, so that's the general population. I think at least today it is at least more theists than atheists. But then when you kind of like look at just the philosophers, it's actually mostly atheists. So it's about 67%, at least of the 2023 Phil Paper survey, were atheists. So more than half. But then when you kind of look at philosophers of religion, so those are people that specialize, right, in questions about the existence of God. That's mostly theists, right? So in 2023, that was about 70%. And again, there's debates here, like, oh, well, maybe the people that were already theists were then attracted to do philosophy of religion, right? So I'm not here to say, like, who's more likely to get it right. The point is just that experts deeply, deeply, deeply disagree about this question. And there's like different demographics you can look at, and you'll get different results of like, is it skewed this way? Is it skewed that way? So like I said, people who study this full time disagree. This has been true throughout history, and this is true today. And this isn't like the flat Earth question, right? Like there is technical disagreement about it, but I think there's a sense in which like we can see this is a settled question, like the Earth is round. The people that believe the Earth is round have this like rational advantage, and then there's these kind of outliers, right? It's not like that, right? There's not a group that's just clearly tracking the truth, and then a group that's kind of like overly questioning this like maybe obvious thing. There's not a group that's clearly responding to the evidence better. There's a symmetry, right? Like the theists seem like they have interesting, important evidence, and the atheists seem like they have interesting, important evidence behind them. And you can also understand, given that, why some people would also be agnostic, right? And so, yeah, the idea is like I just like looking at the reality of the disagreement, how long it's been going on, how many people disagree in different demographics. No group has an obvious rational advantage. Okay, so that's reason one. Reason number two has to do with the evidence itself. So there's different kinds of evidence for and against. There's strong arguments for the existence of God. There's strong arguments against God. We've talked about this a little bit, but there's the cosmological argument for God, looking at kind of like the beginnings of things and God as the first cause. Maybe God is the like originator of the Big Bang, right? The fine-tuning argument, how these qualities and constants are specially fine-tuned for life. And so it's hard to see how that could have happened by random chance. There's moral arguments, like the moral knowledge argument, arguments from religious experience, testimony, miracles. There's like all these arguments that are controversial but interesting, but worth putting weight into, and some people find really convincing. That's not an exhaustive list. The arguments against, right? Problem of evil, we talked about already. Problem of hiddenness, we talked about already. The idea that like if there's a simple natural explanation, we should go with that. That holds weight for some people. Like if you can explain the world with God and without God, kind of go for the simpler explanation. So coherence worries. Are the divine attributes coherent, or are the claims made by religions coherent? So so that's just a brief sampling. The point of this video isn't necessarily go into all of that, but for each of these arguments I mentioned and many more, there's distinct versions. So there's like multiple versions of, say, the cosmological argument. Some depend on like these weird claims about infinities, others don't. Some, whatever, right? And then those are each objected to by different people. Then those are each replied to by sometimes the original person making the argument, or sometimes other people. Sometimes they're modified, right? The process continues. This is just like an ongoing process. And sometimes like we come up with like newer, interesting arguments, right? And maybe they're not totally new, but maybe they are, right? And so it's just like how like there's no end in sight. And so again, it's not like a coin flip where it's just clearly this 50-50 thing. The evidence is complex, it's mixed. The considerations on one side aren't always exactly canceled out by the considerations on the other side. So yeah, we talked about all these different arguments. So the key idea is I don't think the evidence for God just clearly points in one's direction. Yeah, it's complicated, mixed, and I think it just, I don't know if it points anywhere. I don't know if it points in different directions or it just doesn't point at all. It just kind of, yeah, I guess like different pieces of evidence support different things, but when you look at the body of evidence as a whole, it's not clear there's just one perspective it supports. Okay, so that's the second reason for the perspective I take. And then the third has to do with some observations from the divine hiddenness literature, or some people call this the idea that the world is religiously ambiguous. So the existence of God isn't obvious to many people. This is like a key premise of this divine hiddenness argument. Here, I'm not like trying to defend the argument. I'm just taking a piece of that argument and showing how it supports this view. So the idea is that in the literature, sometimes they call them non-resistant non-believers, people who do not believe in God, so they're atheist or agnostic, but it's not because they like are biased or they don't want God to exist. It's just because it's like it's not obvious to them. I don't I think it's an obvious thing that follows from the evidence. The world can be interpreted in different ways. For example, it can be interpreted as created or uncreated. It can be interpreted as divinely orchestrated or maybe more natural and random. Um, and I think many sincere people like that really want to find the truth out, and some of them even really want to believe in God, they remain torn. They remain unconvinced. Like this isn't like God's existence isn't this obvious thing like, oh, we are in St. Louis. This table exists, right? But the evidence leaves room for different reasonable views. Okay. So those are sort of the three reasons I think theists, atheists, and agnostics can all be rational. There's all this disagreement, past history, contemporary disagreement. There's this mixed body of evidence that's qualitatively diverse. It's not like a coin flip case, and the world is religiously ambiguous. So I think there's like multiple rational things, multiple rational perspectives that people can take on the existence of God. Okay, so that's kind of my bit on disagreement. That's sort of like, what do we say about disagreement? I think that does have important implications for how we interact with people who disagree with us. And I also think a lot of controversial issues fall into the same boat where multiple views can be rational. But now I want to kind of make this a little more personal. So go from like these kind of interpersonal facts about disagreement to like the intrapersonal. Like, what does this mean for you? Okay. So, yeah, I've had those first two bullet points already. The question is, could you take a different view and still be rational? Does the evidence force a certain belief about God on you? And I think that's a really interesting question. And some of us might think, well, no, it does feel forced. But as we really reflect on it, It's not because the evidence is forcing it on us. It's because we're kind of in this rut of just like continuing in the view that we've had for such a long time. But when we really step back and think about how complex the evidence is, maybe it doesn't force our belief. And I want to be open to the idea that, maybe some people have had really, really intense religious experiences that they feel like, yeah, theism is the one view that I need to take. And I totally get that. And I think, yes, I'm not making this claim about everyone. There can be people with that exception. There can also be people that maybe had like really intense experiences of evil or just feel like, no, like atheism is like my evidence is rationally requires me to be an atheist. And that's fine too. I'm not necessarily making this claim about every single person in every single situation, no matter what. But I think for a lot of us, like we look at the evidence and we say, wow, it's really complex. It's really qualitatively diverse. I wouldn't necessarily be irrational if I believed differently. I think it's just interesting to kind of reflect and think about that. And I think most of us are probably going to say, no, probably the evidence doesn't force our belief. Um, I think this is partially because there's two different ways of seeing the same world. Um, and like I said, due to the nature of the evidence, it can kind of support more than one way of seeing things. So this isn't just like you disagree because you have this worldview and I disagree because I have that worldview. But like I, as an individual, could actually see things differently in the same way in this picture. I can see it as a duck, and then I can kind of like shift the way I'm looking at it a little bit. And those, you know, the duck's bill, see those as ears, and then, oh, I see a rabbit, right? And this is actually like an example that comes from Peter Van Inwagen. So he's a philosopher. He taught for a long time at Notre Dame. And when he's talking about, he actually converted to Christianity as an adult. And so he talks about how I'll try to give a quote that's like, I'll summarize a little bit, but he says he has a picture of the cosmos, the physical universe, that was this self-subsistent thing. It just was there, it didn't require any explanation. And he would just bring up this mental image of it, and that represented the whole world. And he said before his conversion experience, he had this felt conviction like this just exists and there's nothing outside of it. And he calls that same image to mind now, and it still represents the whole world, but he now has this conviction that it's not self-subsistent, but it depends on something else, something that's not part of the world, but something outside of that, God, right? And he says during his conversion experience, there was like this transition period where he could kind of move back and forth. He could see the image as created and see it as uncreated. He even says in the duck rabbit fashion. And so he would like picture the world and he would say, I can see in some sense the world is created. I can also see in some sense the world as dependent. Sorry, as independent. So created, independent. And so I think this is interesting because it's almost like you're disagreeing with yourself, but it's not just about, yeah, so it's not you and another person disagreeing, but you being able to sort of see the world in different ways. Um, so both views can be live options for you. And, because we're not constantly changing our beliefs, I think we often aren't just like in this like live option space all the time. But when we are going through a paradigm shift or some kind of conversion experience, I think we do find ourselves in places where, wow, okay, I can see the world in the theistic way, I can see the world in an atheistic way, and you can kind of go back and forth. Both interpretations feel natural. All right. And I just want to be clear here. I don't think this is an irrational thing. So I don't think you're just confused or you're ignorant or you're ignoring evidence. But again, these views can be rationally live options for you. Okay. So if you think this is right, what do we say about this? Well, I want to suggest that if you like this picture, then belief in God, but maybe also other beliefs that fall into this same category of complicated evidence, could partially be somewhat like a choice. And because if you're kind of looking at some question and you're like, look, I can see the world is created, I can see it is uncreated, I can see um, the view that God exists, and I can also see the view that God doesn't exist. What's happening there is the evidence is not forcing a belief onto you. It doesn't settle the question, but really what you're kind of at a fork in the road where there's more than one rational path you could take, right? And I think in cases like that, Belief is more like an action than we often think of belief. We often think like, okay, I look outside, I see there's grass, I believe there's grass, right? But in these kinds of cases, because the evidence is ambiguous, it's kind of more like, okay, should I become a lawyer or should I become a philosopher? Should I eat an apple or should I eat an orange, to use like a more trivial example, right? Um, so I'm open to, at least in some cases, belief being something more like a choice. So the key idea here is that the only thing, it's like some people think we only choose our actions and our beliefs just come to us. And I think, no, that actually doesn't, like sometimes our beliefs just come to us, but sometimes our actions just come to us too. Like we do a lot of things automatically out of habit, right? Um, and I think no, and sometimes in cases where the evidence doesn't force a perspective on us, we can actually choose what we believe. Okay. So what does this mean about the nature of conversion? And by conversion, I really just mean like going from like being an atheist to being a theist or vice versa. Well, I think it's not just a matter of our evidence changing. It doesn't just mean we got new evidence or realized our old evidence was undermined or something, right? But I think sometimes we change beliefs because we reinterpret the same evidence or we come to see the same evidence with a new worldview. Or even we make a commitment. We say, look, I think this is like a beautiful thing and it would be awesome if it were true. And even if that doesn't give me evidence that it's true, I want to commit to like this way of seeing things. I think this is something like what happened to Peter Van Inwagen in his conversion. I think he was clearly saying he didn't feel forced to be a theist by his evidence, but he committed to being a theist because um, that was the path he decided to take. That was the path he wanted to take. And so I think this idea tells us something interesting about conversion. It's sometimes it's more like a shift in perspective than just getting in new data. And I think that shift in perspective can actually be perfectly rational. You're kind of shifting frameworks, you're shifting worldview. So the key idea here is that rational change without new evidence is possible. Okay, so let me give some takeaways, some things that I think we can learn from this. The first, going back to disagreement, I think this is really important. Don't assume that people who disagree with you are just automatically irrational, but take seriously views that differ than your own. And again, rational belief isn't true belief. You can say, yeah, like I think my belief is true and I think yours isn't true, but I think we can both be rational. I think we're both kind of looking at the evidence in a reasonable way. We might either have different evidence or we might just be taking different perspectives on the same evidence. So I think this encourages us not to be dogmatic, but to really be empathetic. Like, yeah, I get why you concluded that given the evidence. Okay, so that's like the first really important thing. The second kind of is about you as a believer. Sometimes the evidence leaves room for choice. I think this happens with God, but I think this also happens with other really complicated questions where the evidence is ambiguous. And because the evidence leaves room for choice, I think sometimes beliefs aren't just discovered, but they're actually adopted. We choose to adopt them in the same way we choose to take action, we choose to believe. And I think in along a similar vein, this suggests that belief can be more like a commitment than just a conclusion. Some people, I think about belief as like doing a math problem, like you add up all the things and then you come to the one right conclusion, right? But I think it's not always like that. I think it's sometimes more like ethics, where we have multiple options. And because of this, what you believe about God might be, in part, up to you. Yeah. So that's all I have today. I'm really interested to hear what you think, both about like disagreement and the evidence, but also about like your own beliefs. Do you think beliefs could be chosen in the way I've suggested and kind of beliefs are a little more action-like than people have thought? Do you think this applies to belief in God? Have you ever made a commitment to believe something or what did that look like? So let me know in the comments. And yeah, have a great rest of your day, everyone. Talk to you later.